Time smooths even the sharpest moments into memory. But what happens when that memory belongs to a single mind that watches empires rise and fall? The answer is a small green shadow moving quietly through galactic history. The story of that shadow is Yoda, a being whose life would shape the fate of Jedi and Sith across 9 centuries, yet passed through it all, almost unnoticed. To most in the wider galaxy, the Force binds all living things, yet within that endless current, there are rare lives that endure far beyond the span of ordinary generations. Yoda was one of those lives. His existence stretched for more than 900 years, long enough to see the Republic flourish and decay, long enough to watch the Jedi Order ascend to its greatest power and then collapse into ruin over time. What followed was not a tale of conquest or war, but of patience, restraint, and quiet presence. Unlike many masters in Jedi records, Yoda's beginning stands in deliberate shadow. His species remains unnamed, his homeworld unlisted. The archives that preserve battles and treaties have no clear entry. For the first place, he opened his eyes only scattered hints of an obscure swamp world far from the major hyperlanes, a place of mist and still water, where the Force whispered softly through tangled roots and low-hanging branches. What they found there would change everything, because from that forgotten world came a child who would one day guide almost every generation of Jedi younglings. Centuries later, most remember Yoda bent with age on a different swamp world. Dagobah, a small figure in a crude hut stirring a simple pot of food, surrounded by fog and buzzing life. To many, that lonely image feels the beginning of his story, the moment a strange hermit meets a young pilot from a fallen farm. Yet in truth, Dagobah is the final refuge at the end of an impossibly long journey. The quiet aftermath of councils held in marble halls, of starships burning in clone wars, of failures carried in silence. This is the purpose of the tale that follows, to walk slowly and calmly through the entirety of Yoda's known life, from those obscure beginnings in the mists to his final transformation into a luminous Force spirit. It will move in order step by step, from early training in the Jedi Temple, through the High Republic, the Clone Wars, the fall of the Jedi Order, and the long exile that prepared his last teachings for. Now the task is simple. Breathe. Let the scale of 9 centuries wash past generations of nameless Jedi trained and lost republics rising and crumbling, Sith plots unfolding in the shadows for the next 1,000 years and more. Yoda's presence will be there, a small, constant shape in the background of great events. This is a complete, gentle narrative, a path that does not demand wakefulness. Every detail will still be here, waiting whenever the listener returns. Across galactic history, certain figures appear only for a moment and then vanish. Their names lost to archives and forgotten wars, but there are a few whose lives become measuring sticks for entire ages. Yoda is one of those rare constants, a quiet observer whose lifespan turns distant eras into chapters of a single long story, the story of a galaxy seen through patient eyes. Born centuries before the age, later called the High Republic, Yoda enters history as a small presence in a much older Jedi Order, his true homeworld left deliberately unnamed, his species hidden in mystery. The only clear anchor is the moment he is found by wandering Jedi and carried from an obscure swamp world to the shining heart of the Republic. What they found there would change everything, not through raw power or prophecy, but through endurance, a being who would simply remain. Over time, the Republic rises into its golden age, starlanes, mapped temples raised on 1,000 worlds. The Jedi stand as guardians of peace in a galaxy that believes in its own stability. In those marble halls, Yoda is no hermit. He walks beneath towering statues through echoing training chambers and serene council rooms, his voice shaping lesson after lesson. For generations of younglings, entire cohorts of Jedi pass through his classes. Faces blur together into a steady river of apprentices and knights, while he endures at the center. This is the quiet contrast at the heart of his life. In the films, the first glimpse is of a strange old creature in a swamp, a trickster hidden among roots and mist, yet for hundreds of years. Before that, Yoda presides over grand councils. He sits in the highest chamber of the Jedi Temple, while Starfleets launch and senates debate. He is addressed as Grand Master, the calm center of the Order, in an era that still believes the light side has already won. By the time the Phantom Menace unfolds, Yoda is already around 860 to 870 years old. He has watched previous chancellors rise and fall, seen border skirmishes flare and fade, judged countless disputes that never entered legend when the Trade Federation blockade of Naboo begins. It is only the latest disturbance in a long chain of conflicts, but what followed was different. The first tremor of a deeper dark returning to the galactic stage. Across the High Republic's optimism, the prequel era's subtle decay, the Clone Wars, and the birth of the Empire, Yoda remains a continuous thread. Later, he will sit in exile on Dagobah, while Luke Skywalker trains in the mist, and later still, he will linger as a quiet Force spirit at the dawn of a new Jedi. But all of that lies ahead. The question hangs gently over his centuries. What does it feel to watch the galaxy change for nearly 1,000 years as this story unfolds? The path will keep circling back to that feeling, to this small figure standing at the crossroads of eras. To stand at the crossroads of eras is to stand in mystery, and few figures in galactic history are wrapped in mystery more gently than Yoda. Power, in his case, does not begin with a throne, an empire, or a war. It begins with an unanswered question. His species is unnamed. His homeworld is unmarked on any star chart. For thousands of years, scholars, Jedi, and even Sith have searched records and legends for a clue and found only deliberate silence. This is not an accident of poor record-keeping. It is an intentional veil, drawn by storytellers around a single small life. In that silence, the story of his beginnings becomes a soft canvas, a place where the imagination can wander without conflict or fear. Picture an unnamed world at the edge of known space, neither fully swamp nor forest, but something between. Low mist drifts through twisted trees. Broad leaves catch droplets of water that fall in slow, patient rhythms. Pools of dark, still water mirror a pale sky, broken only by the quiet ripple of unseen creatures. Bioluminescent plants glow in muted blues and greens, their light reflected on smooth stones and tangled roots. The air is warm, heavy, and calm. In this hush, a small green child moves through the reeds. His ears catch every distant splash, every wing beat. Long before any formal training, there is a faint awareness of the Force, not as doctrine, but as a gentle pressure in the chest, a sense that the wind and the water and the heartbeat of the world are all part of one continuous breath. Over time, this awareness will deepen, but here it is no more than a feeling that nothing is ever truly alone. Legends whisper that he was not alone even then. Beside him, another of his kind, a friend whose name changes from tale to tale, shares the same quiet world and the same strange intuition. What followed was a journey that begins not with heroism, but with an accident. A simple starship, meant for short travel, carried them away from their hidden home. A storm in hyperspace, a failed system, and suddenly, the stars outside were wrong. They were stranded, far from the mist and the glowing pools. Drifting in an unfamiliar sector, that small vessel was discovered by a passing Jedi Master. Some versions name this figure, others do not. All agree on one thing. The moment the Jedi stepped aboard, the air felt different. The Master sensed two bright points in the Force, untrained yet astonishingly clear. What they found there would change everything, not through conquest or dark side ambition, but through quiet potential. There could have been fear or dismissal, or a decision to turn away. Instead, there was compassion. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. The children were brought toward the Republic, toward Coruscant, toward the Great Temple, whose towers rose above the endless city. For the small green child, the transition from misty forests to crowded star lanes was overwhelming. Metal corridors replaced roots and soil. The hum of engines drowned the sounds of insects and falling water. He was nervous, curious, and very small against the scale of the galaxy. Stars slid past the viewport in silent streams, each one a place he did not know. The Jedi spoke of the Order, of the light side and the dark, of guardianship and peace. The words were too large to grasp, but the feeling in the Master's presence was steady and calm, a new kind of shelter. As the transport descended through Coruscant's traffic lanes, endless lights rose around him in layered rivers. The temple's stone corridors awaited, vast halls, towering statues of ancient Jedi, training rooms filled with the hum of practice sabers. At that threshold, the unknown child from an unnamed world paused, alone among the stars, yet no longer lost. His real story was about to begin, and the first step he took into the Jedi Temple would shape everything that followed. Beyond that threshold, the Temple of Light opened around him in quiet enormity. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it hums in stone and whispers along polished floors. For a child no taller than a robed knee, the Jedi Temple on Coruscant was less a building and more a mountain carved into the sky, its spires vanishing into the glow of the galactic capital far above. Inside, the air felt cool and ancient. Echoing halls stretched in long, measured lines, broken by towering statues of long-dead masters whose names were already fading into history. Hooded figures of stone gazed down with calm, unblinking patience, robes frozen in mid-flow, sabers carved at their sides. To most visitors, they represented the lineage of the Order. To the small green newcomer, they were giants of the light side, watching each hesitant step. For thousands of years, Force-sensitive children had been brought here from distant worlds. Some arrived from glittering core planets, others from forgotten backwaters where the Republic's maps grew thin. But what followed was always the same pattern. Quiet conversations with worried families, the soft presence of a Jedi envoy, and then a journey toward Coruscant, toward the temple that would become home. The story of each initiate began in separation, and then in belonging. Within the temple, these children were gathered into clans rather than traditional families. They slept in shared dormitories, learned in circular classrooms, and meditated in chambers open to the endless city beyond. Their days unfolded in gentle discipline, early lessons in philosophy, simple katas with training sabers that hummed harmlessly, and supervised play that taught cooperation rather than conflict. Over time, the rituals of the Order wrapped around them, the bow before a master, the quiet of the meditation mat, the stillness before drawing on the Force. In those first days, Yoda's smallness was impossible to ignore. His ears dipped when older initiates rushed past, his three-fingered hands clutched at simple robes that dragged along the floor. In another place, his strange form might have drawn whispers or fear. Here, the Jedi regarded him with the same steady gaze they gave to all younglings. They did not see a curiosity. They saw currents in the Force. Masters sensed in him an unusual stillness, a contemplative depth out of proportion to his years. During group meditations, when other children fidgeted or let their minds drift toward games and starships, this quiet initiate listened to the living force flowing through the temple gardens, through the trees imported from 100 worlds, through the tiny creatures nesting in the eaves. Yet he was uncertain too, reaching for disciplines his body and mind had not yet mastered. In training rooms lined with practice droids and padded floors, his movements were hesitant, then a little surer. A wooden saber felt heavy in his hands, its balance strange, its reach longer than his own arm span. Instructors adjusted stances, repositioned feet, and spoke of focus, control, and defense. These were the first seeds of a philosophy that would shape every decision he made. Few noticed in those early years how his gaze lingered on the council spire, or how his steps slowed beneath the great statues in the Hall of Knighthood. The same corridors where he now shuffled nervously would one day echo with his staff tapping in authority, his voice guiding generations. The temple did not yet know that this smallest of initiates would sit at its very heart, watching the rise and fall of galactic peace. For now, though, he was only a child among many, breathing in the quiet of the temple at night, feeling the city's endless murmur beyond its walls, and learning the first, fragile difference between reaching for power and listening to the Force. As the years passed, the quiet of the temple at night gave way to the restless motion of starships and distant worlds. The child who listened to the city's murmur would soon listen to the galaxy itself through the eyes and voices of others. This was the path of a Padawan, to be chosen by a knight or master to leave the marble halls behind and walk into the living currents of the Force. In time, an older Jedi claimed the small, green initiate, a contemplative master whose name is lost to history, but whose teachings would shape everything that followed under this mentor. Yoda learned what most Padawans only repeated as doctrine: that compassion was essential, yet attachment was dangerous, that a Jedi must care deeply, but hold nothing so tightly that fear of losing it could open a door to the dark side around this period. Yoda's life became a series of journeys, each world a lesson rather than a destination on one frontier settlement. He watched his master mediate a land dispute between farmers and corporate agents. There was no war there, only anger, fear, and hunger. Yet the tension in that small council chamber felt as sharp as any battlefield when the master chose compromise over victory. Yoda saw that power in the light side often meant accepting that no one left entirely satisfied. What followed was stranger. On a mining moon torn by rebellion, Yoda saw blaster-scorched streets and families caught between insurgents. And local authorities, the Padawan expected the Jedi to pick a side. Instead, his master moved among both factions, healing the wounded, calming leaders, urging restraint. The conflict ended not with triumph, but with a fragile ceasefire and heavy silence. That night, Yoda asked why they had not simply imposed peace. The answer was simple. The Jedi were not an empire. They were guardians, not rulers, over time. These missions carved questions into Yoda's mind. He watched refugees who would never see justice, criminals who escaped through legal loopholes, leaders who agreed to peace, only to break it in secret. The limits of Jedi power became painfully clear. Even with the Force, a single knight could not be everywhere, could not save everyone. That realization settled into him, not as despair, but as humility. It was during these centuries of quiet observation that Yoda's speech and teaching style began to bend into their later form. His master spoke in long, careful lectures. Yoda distilled them into short inversions and simple phrases so that truth would be remembered under stress. Do or do not. There is no try. Was not cleverness. It was the end result of watching countless beings hesitate at the edge of choice. This was the story of a mind learning that fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. Not as a prophecy, but as a pattern seen again and again across the galactic frontier. And beneath that pattern, a deeper unease grew. How far should the Jedi go to prevent that chain from forming? How much intervention would become? Control these early doubts would shape his every council vote when war finally came. For now he remained a Padawan walking beside an aging master, seeing mercy fail in some systems and succeed in others. Each act of restraint, each refusal to dominate, planted the seed of Yoda's later regret. He knew already that even the greatest Jedi could not hold back every darkness, a truth that would haunt him when the Clone Wars turned the Order into generals. And yet his master's calm never wavered, even in failure. That unshaken serenity became Yoda's North Star, a standard he would spend the next 100 years trying to reach. Long before he sat in the Grand Council chamber, the small Padawan had already learned the hardest lesson of the light side, that wisdom without humility curdled into arrogance. And arrogance in the Jedi could invite the very shadow they sought to oppose, from student to master. The long ascent humility had been planted in him early, and what followed was not a sudden rise to greatness, but a long, slow climb measured in centuries when his trials were finally complete. Yoda knelt in the candlelit halls of the temple, surrounded by robed figures whose lifespans would be brief next to his. The ceremony was simple. A lightsaber touched each shoulder, words of duty and balance were spoken, and the small Padawan stood as a Jedi Knight. Around those early decades, his missions rarely involved grand battles. Instead, he was sent to border worlds where trade guilds threatened blockade and profit had become more important than people. He mediated disputes between merchants and farmers, on rain-swept agri moons, sat in dim council chambers on distant space stations, and listened to governors who feared that any concession would invite revolt. He drew his saber only to deflect a stray blaster bolt or end a moment of panic. His true power was the way tempers cooled when he entered a room, the way arguments lost their edge in the presence of that quiet, steady calm. Over time, patterns emerged that shorter lived. Jedi barely noticed. A local conflict on one rimworld echoed a quarrel he had seen a century before. On the core worlds, a charismatic demagogue rose, promising order through strength, then fell into corruption, just as another had generations earlier. Wars flared. Treaties were signed. Empires rose and fragmented, and still the Force flowed on in cycles of dark side ambition and light side restraint. The story of Yoda's life became the story of watching history repeat and learning to respond with patience rather than despair. As decades turned to centuries, he shifted from negotiator to mentor. At first, he guided a single Padawan on cautious journeys through the mid-rim. Then he took on 2 apprentices in succession, then entire clans of younglings in the temple training halls. What began as quiet advice on footwork and meditation slowly expanded into philosophy lessons for newly minted knights, and later into private counsel for seasoned masters who had begun to doubt their own judgment. His reputation did not come from dramatic heroics, but from the steady pattern of those who sought his guidance and left with clearer purpose. By the time of the High Republic era, Yoda was already a respected master. His small figure, often absent from the council chamber, not through neglect but through choice, he preferred to travel with groups of younglings on training cruises to frontier stations or to oversee delicate projects where the Republic met the unknown. He walked among half-built outposts, watched Jedi and settlers raise shields and spires against the wilderness, and taught that the Order's task was not control, but harmony over centuries of such service. Something subtle shifted within the temple walls. The Order no longer looked to Yoda only as a teacher of forms and meditation, but as a moral compass. When debate turned fierce, his quiet word would shape the final decision, setting the stage for the day. That calm voice would guide the entire council as Grand Master. The High Republic. Yoda in an age of light, yet even that calm voice had been forged in an age far brighter than the one remembered from the fall hundreds of years before the Phantom Menace, in an era later called the High Republic. The Jedi Order stood at its height. The Republic expanded its borders not through conquest, but through cooperation. Star by star, great gleaming stations and waypoints lit the hyperlanes, and for a second time, it seemed the light side held the advantage across the galactic map. The story of Yoda in this age is not of a cloistered sage, but of a restless guardian, moving with the frontier itself around 2 centuries before the rise of the Sith Empire that would become the modern rule of two-line Yoda, served not as Grand Master, but as a roving teacher. He spent long stretches away from Coruscant, traveling on Jedi cruisers that carried entire classes of younglings into the unknown regions of space. What followed was a kind of moving academy. He supervised their first missions on half-settled worlds, corrected stances in the middle of jungle clearings, and turned distant outposts into temporary classrooms. In these years, the Order's task seemed clear. The Republic built beacons such as Starlight Station to stabilize the Rim, and the Jedi answered distress calls more often about famine and diplomacy than war. When conflict did come, it arrived in strange forms. the great disaster shattered hyperspace. Routes and tore ships from the lanes, Yoda helped coordinate relief efforts, guiding frightened Padawans through fields of drifting wreckage, teaching them to listen not only for danger, but for the faint signatures of survivors in the Force. Yet the High Republic was not without darkness. The marauding Nihil struck from the storms at the edge of known space, and the plant, like Drengir, seeped out of forgotten temples, spreading corruption through soil and mind alike, facing enemies that could not be met by simple blade work. Yoda leaned ever more heavily on patience and insight. He reminded his students that the Force was not merely a weapon, but a living current to be read and understood. He taught that against chaos and terror, the first duty of a Jedi was to become still. Over time, these crises reinforced a lesson he would carry into every later century, that even in an age of light, the dark side waited in neglected corners of history and space. He watched promising knights fall or vanish on distant assignments and answered their loss, not with anger, but with deeper humility in councils during the High Republic. He argued that victory meant restoring balance, not annihilating every threat. This golden age, with its bright temples and hopeful younglings, would shape his expectations forever for the next 1,000 years. Whenever he sat in the council chamber, Yoda carried the memory of beacons shining along safe hyperlanes and of a republic that listened to its guardians. When that trust began to erode and the Senate grew entangled in greed, the contrast cut deeper for him than for most. That quiet wait would follow him into the era of clones and secret Sith, where the familiar patterns of crisis returned, but the answers he once trusted no longer seemed to work. Grand Master of the Order. By the time that trust began to fray in the Senate chambers far above Coruscant, Yoda's place within the Jedi Temple had already crystallized into something unique. Power in the Jedi Order did not wear a crown or command legions. It sat in a circle, and at its quiet center was a small green figure who spoke softly and carried centuries of memory. The Jedi Council was meant to be the Order's calm mind. 12 seats in a perfect ring. No throne, no dais. Only equals facing one another so that no single Jedi overshadowed the rest. Yet even in that design, there existed a subtle exception. Among those 12, tradition recognized a Grand Master, not an Emperor, but a first among equals, entrusted with guiding the Order's philosophy, its long-term direction, and its response to the changing tides of the Galactic Republic. In the council chamber high atop the temple, tall windows arched from floor to ceiling, flooding the room with Coruscant's hazy light. The seats formed a smooth circle upon polished stone, each chair shaped to its occupant. Yoda's was slightly elevated, a high-backed cushion that lifted his small form to the level of his peers. The image became iconic, a diminutive figure, hands folded on a simple cane, framed by open sky. It was a visual symbol of quiet authority, of accumulated wisdom that did not need to shout. Over time, that role demanded more than ceremonial presence. Yoda became the one who weighed ancient Jedi texts against new realities, who listened when younger masters warned of shadows in the Force, and who decided when to cling to tradition and when to bend. The Republic's politics grew tangled, the Senate more distant, and subtle, dark side currents began to stir beneath the surface of galactic peace. The story of Yoda as Grand Master is the story of a constant balance, preserving vows made for thousands of years while adapting to threats no holocron had fully anticipated. As Grand Master, Yoda was not only a decision maker, he was a teacher of teachers. Generations of Jedi came to him first as younglings, gathered in training rooms where practice sabers hummed and small hands reached out to feel the Force for the very first time. Many of those children would later become knights, then masters with Padawans of their own, carrying traces of Yoda's lessons into battles and negotiations never shown on screen. His influence would shape countless lives that vanished into the background of galactic history, nameless guardians whose quiet victories kept the Republic from sliding into open war. What followed was an invisible web of mentorship stretching across centuries. A single correction in a training exercise, a gentle rebuke when anger flared, a rare word of praise when compassion won out over fear. These moments echoed outward through lineages of teachers and students. For the next 1,000 years of the Jedi Order's height, there were few lightsabers raised in defense that did not carry some distant reflection of Yoda's guidance. Yet that central position carried a cost. When the Council misjudged a threat, when the Senate slipped further under unseen influence, when a gifted knight began to walk dangerously close to the dark, the failure did not feel abstract to Yoda. It was personal. Every misstep seemed to stain those centuries of teaching, to call into question choices made in that sunlit chamber with the tall windows and the perfect circle of chairs. In time, this burden would grow heavier, pressing down on the Grand Master as the Clone Wars erupted and a hidden Sith Lord moved pieces across the board. The next time Yoda sat in that chamber, staring out over the endless city, the question that haunted him would no longer be whether the Order was guiding the Republic, but whether, without realizing it, it had already helped to destroy it. The Temple's heart, Yoda and the younglings. In those same towering halls where Yoda questioned the fate of the Republic, another, quieter current of the Force flowed every day. Power and politics played out in the council chamber, but below it, in polished training rooms and echoing corridors, the future of the Jedi was shaped one hesitant step at a time. Within the temple, youngling clans moved in small constellations. The Bear Clan, the Hawkbat Clan, others with names meant to inspire courage and grace. Children from every corner of the Galactic Republic stood in loose circles, practiced sabers humming at low power, wooden training remotes drifting between them. In one room, an instructor guided them through the code, soft voices reciting that there was no emotion, there was peace. In another, rows of tiny figures sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, learning to feel the faintest ripple of the Force in the air. The story of Yoda's public life often centers on councils, wars, and confrontations with the dark side. But his truest work unfolded here. Over time, he became less a distant Grand Master and more the Temple's heart, appearing among the younglings with a quiet tap of his gimmer stick and a patient, knowing gaze. In the same chamber seen during the search for Kamino, he stood among a ring of children facing the star map, their small hands raised, their minds reaching. When Obi-Wan's query about a missing world baffled the archivists, it was the younglings who solved the riddle under Yoda's guidance. He did not simply correct the map. He turned absence into lesson. A world erased from the charts became a question about trust, perception, and the limits of knowledge. His words were gentle, his tone almost mischievous, yet the concept was grave. Even the greatest archives could be deceived, and even the Jedi could be blinded. This was his pattern for centuries. A failed levitation became a chance to speak of patience. A dropped saber turned into a meditation on fear, on how the dark side fed on frustration. When a child asked what happened to those who fell, he did not answer with threats, but with quiet honesty, wrapping terrible truths in reassurance until they could be held without breaking. Humor softened the edges, but never hid the reality that loss and war were woven into Jedi history. Many who later strode through those halls as knights, masters, even council members, had once stared up at Yoda from barely waist height. Plo Koon, Ki-Adi Mundi, perhaps even Mace Windu in his earliest years, had felt that same steady presence at their backs. What followed was a living chain of mentorship that would shape generations. Through them, through their Padawans and their Padawans' Padawans, Yoda's teachings flowed into countless unseen stories across the Republic. Then comes the pattern that shatters the pattern. The image of those training rooms, filled with laughter and humming sabers, stands in violent contrast to what the Temple will become under Order 66. The quiet clans, the whispered recitations of the code, the small hands reaching for the light side of the Force, all are swept away in a single night of blaster fire and betrayal. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, not because it was outshone, but because it was denied. The mercy Yoda gave to frightened children for hundreds of years was not granted to them in the end. In exile on Dagobah, surrounded by swamp and mist, that absence hangs around him as heavily as the humid air. Every new student he meets carries the shadow of those he could not save. And the next time a farm boy stands before him asking to be trained, the memory of those lost younglings will guide both his caution and his hope. Philosopher of the Force. In that mist and memory, Yoda's teachings settle into something quieter and sharper, the philosophy of a survivor who has watched the galaxy turn through war and fragile peace. Power tempts, the dark side whispers, empires rise and fall. But what remains when armies are gone and temples are dust? For Yoda, the answer is the Force itself. Over time, his most iconic lines become the clearest window into that belief. Luminous beings are we. Not this crude matter is not a poetic flourish, but the distilled conclusion of centuries watching Jedi live and die. He has seen bodies fail on battlefields from the High Republic to the Clone Wars, seen Republic banners replaced by Imperial ones, and understood that the story of any one order or empire is brief compared to the deeper current beneath it. To him, the true self is that current, the light side flowing through every living thing, not the fragile shell that carries a lightsaber. The same is true of his warning. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. This is not an abstract mantra. It is a map drawn from generations of fallen Jedi, each one a case study in how a single unmastered fear can spiral into galactic conflict. A knight terrified of loss becomes possessive, a protector becomes a conqueror, and what followed was always the same pattern. The dark side feeding on that fear until it consumes everything around it. Because of this, Yoda urges non-attachment and acceptance of death as natural. For hundreds of years, he has outlived almost every Padawan he has ever trained. He has watched promising younglings grow into masters, then into names carved on memorial walls. The living Force shows him that life is motion, not possession. To cling is to deny reality. When he tells Anakin that mourning is natural, but that one must rejoice for those who transform into the Force, it is the hard wisdom of someone who has stood at too many pyres. His focus rests on the living Force more than the distant unifying Force. Be present, feel, listen. On the battlefields of Geonosis and Kashyyyk, he closes his eyes, not to control events, but to sense the currents of life around him and act in harmony with them. The future matters, yet he distrusts visions that promise certainty, knowing how easily the dark side twists them into traps. But this philosophy has limits. His strict stance on attachment and fear, while meant to shield the Jedi from the dark, leaves him ill-equipped to understand Anakin's desperate need for connection. Where Yoda sees a universal pattern, Anakin experiences an unbearable, specific pain. That gap blinds the Grand Master at the very moment when insight is most needed. For the next 1,000 years, his teachings would shape the Jedi who never meet him, echoing through holocrons and stories. But in his own lifetime, those beliefs are about to be tested by a darkness growing right beside him, one he can sense in the Force yet still cannot fully see. Whispers, before the storm, the late Republic, in the quiet century before the Clone Wars, the Republic still called itself a beacon of peace, yet its foundations were already beginning to crack. For thousands of years, it had expanded across the stars, weaving world after world into a single galactic tapestry. By this late age, the tapestry was frayed. The Senate was vast, slow, and buried beneath procedure favors and backroom promises. Over time, the Republic's ideals remained noble on paper, but in practice, credit spoke louder than conscience. Entire sectors languished, while core world corporations grew fat on distant resources. Laws meant to prevent conflict were twisted to protect monopolies rather than people in this climate. The Jedi Order stood as guardians of the peace, yet even they were being pulled thin across an empire of trade routes and disputed borders around this period. Master Yoda sat at the heart of Jedi power on the High Council, Small and still, yet carrying centuries of history in his eyes, he had watched the Order change from an almost monastic brotherhood into an institution expected to answer every dispute, arbitration, and border skirmish the Senate could not resolve. He agreed that protecting life was their duty, but a quiet concern grew within him. That concern centered on politics. The Jedi now walked the polished floors of the Senate, almost as often as the stone corridors of their own temple. Their advice influenced elections, trade, legislation, and even military funding. Yoda argued again and again that the Jedi must serve the Force, not parties or interests yet. He still believed they could be a force for good, gently guiding leaders away from war without becoming soldiers themselves. As the decades passed, something subtler began to change. The Force itself felt different. Meditation no longer brought the same clarity. Visions that once unfolded in clean, symbolic patterns became hazy and fragmented. Yoda and other masters spoke of a cloud, a veil resting over the future. They could sense in balance a slow tilt toward the dark side, but not its source. What followed was a strange dissonance across the Order. Some Jedi dismissed the unease as a consequence of galactic complexity. Others whispered of ancient prophecies, stirring again in the archives. Yoda listened to all of it, yet found no single thread to follow. The Sith were believed extinct, destroyed a millennium earlier. Their empire broken, their last lords hunted down by Jedi who had passed into legend. But in the shadowed spaces between laws and trade disputes, something else was moving unseen, a presence feeding on corruption and fear, exploiting exactly the blind spots Yoda feared in the Senate's endless arguments and the Jedi's growing pride. The dark side was patient, and the Sith had learned to hide at the very end of this long, uneasy peace. Yoda stood at the edge of a precipice he could not quite perceive. The Republic still functioned, the Temple still hummed with training sabers and quiet lessons, yet the currents of the Force were converging on a single point. Soon, on a desert world, long ignored, a boy would be found. What they found there would change everything. And the story of Yoda's greatest triumphs and deepest failures was about to begin again. The boy from Tatooine. First meeting with Anakin, high above the endless cityscape of Coruscant, in a circular chamber ringed with tall chairs and older eyes. The currents of the Force narrowed to a single small figure. A boy from a desert world stood in the center of the Jedi Council room, and the story of Yoda's greatest doubt took on a face. Anakin Skywalker was 9 years old, sandy-haired, sunburned from Tatooine's twin suns, and carrying something no Jedi had ever seen. His blood sang with an unprecedented concentration of midi-chlorians, the microscopic messengers of the Force that had guided the Order for thousands of years. Yet what Yoda felt first was not power. It was fear. Yoda watched the boy as the Masters questioned him. The chamber was quiet, the hum of distant traffic muffled by layers of stone and tradition. Anakin's eyes flicked to the door, to the windows, to the unfamiliar robed figures. His voice trembled when he spoke of leaving his mother behind on Tatooine. Beneath the surface of every answer, Yoda sensed a clinging thread of attachment, a desperate refusal to lose the one person who had ever truly protected him for the Jedi. This was not a small concern their code had been shaped over, time by hard lessons about possession and loss, fear of losing power, fear of losing loved ones. These emotions opened cracks where the dark side could seep in. Yoda felt that same pattern coiled tightly in Anakin's heart, a fierce love that could turn to terror in an instant. He asked the boy if he was afraid. Anakin said no, but the Force around him shivered with denial. To the Council, the problem was not only what Anakin felt, but when he had been found by Jedi standards, he was already too old. Most younglings entered the temple as toddlers before deep attachments could form. Anakin had lived a life of slavery on a harsh frontier world. He had known hunger, danger, and the constant threat of separation from his mother. Training such a child meant asking him to cut away bonds that had already become his foundation. The Council's initial answer was refusal. Yoda spoke cautiously, yet firmly. The future around the boy was clouded. His path was hard to see, and what followed was a rare moment of open disagreement between Jedi and the dying Qui-Gon Jinn, who insisted Anakin was the chosen one, destined to bring balance to the Force. Then everything shifted. Qui-Gon fell on Naboo, struck down by Darth Maul, the Sith warrior whose very existence confirmed that the ancient enemy had returned in the grief and urgency that followed. Obi-Wan Kenobi asked to honor his master's last wish by training Anakin himself. The Council relented. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, but in that moment it felt almost quiet. Yoda agreed, yet his misgivings did not fade. Compassion for the frightened child warred with duty to rules meant to shield the Order from the dark side. He sensed that by bending those rules, the Jedi were stepping onto a dangerous path, one that would shape the coming Clone Wars, the fall of the Jedi Temple, and eventually Yoda's own exile on a distant swamp world far from Coruscant's glow. In the stillness after the decision, as Anakin bowed and Obi-Wan pledged to train him, Yoda gazed into the boy's future and saw only turbulence. The council chamber remained unchanged, polished floors, tall windows, soft light, but beneath that calm surface, galactic history had just tilted. The next time Yoda faced Anakin across this room, it would be in the shadow of war, and the first cracks in the Order's foundations would already be spreading. A shadow revealed the Sith return. The polished floors of the council chamber had seen centuries of debate, but in the years after Anakin's arrival, the shine began to hide something heavier in the Force. There was an unease beneath the rituals of the Jedi, an invisible pressure building in the galactic background, as if the light side itself were holding its breath. The story of Master Yoda in this era became the story of a guardian who sensed a storm long before he could see its shape. That storm finally broke on the distant world of Naboo. While the Senate argued, and the Trade Federation tightened its blockade, a more ancient conflict returned to the open. A cloaked warrior wielding a double-bladed lightsaber stepped from the shadows of the What followed was a duel that shattered 1,000 years of certainty. Qui-Gon Jinn and his apprentice, Obi-Wan Kenobi, faced Darth Maul, a living Sith Lord in a time when the Sith were believed extinct. The fight unfolded in humming energy and echoing halls, red against green and blue. The clash of blades carried the weight of forgotten wars. Maul's ferocity was not random, it was trained-focused, the embodiment of a tradition the Jedi had consigned to history. When the energy gates parted and Maul struck Qui-Gon down, the death of one master became a message to another across the stars. The balance Yoda had defended for centuries had just been wounded in the council chamber. The report of a Sith warrior landed with a quiet shock. There was no denial, only a chilling recalculation. If a Sith had attacked, then the old rule must still hold, always. 2. There are no more, no less, a master and an apprentice. The implication was worse than the news of Maul's existence, because it meant someone else was out there, patient, hidden, directing events with a purpose the Jedi had failed to see for Yoda. This revelation did not come as a complete surprise. It confirmed the darkening he had felt for years, yet it offered no clarity. The Force was clouded visions that once stretched across decades, now dissolved into fragments. Futures blurred together into fog. The Grand Master, who had guided generations, suddenly found his sight shortened to days and hours. He admitted what few Jedi wanted to hear. The dark side had wrapped itself around everything, even their own order. The true architect, Darth Sidious, sat in the Senate chamber, robed not in black but in authority. Each speech, each emergency power granted, moved pieces on a board. Only he understood over time his influence would shape entire campaigns and laws, while remaining unseen. This was the most dangerous power of all corruption. Without a visible hand as the phantom menace faded from public view, Yoda understood that something deeper had begun. The game was already in motion, but he was stepping onto a board an enemy had spent years arranging, and the next moves would draw the Jedi into a war they were not prepared to fight. Mentor at a distance. Watching Anakin grow in the uneasy calm that followed the crisis on Naboo, the Jedi Temple returned to its routines, yet beneath the polished floors and echoing halls, something had shifted. The Council had allowed a 9-year-old boy from the Outer Rim into their ranks, a child whom the Force itself seemed to surround in turbulent currents. In this period, between the Phantom Menace and the first open shots of the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi became Anakin Skywalker's formal master. But Yoda remained a quieter presence, watching from the high seats of the council chamber and from the shadows of training halls. Over time, the story of Anakin's growth became one more thread in the vast tapestry of Jedi history. Yet it was a thread Yoda followed with unusual care during sparring sessions. Yoda observed the boy's power break through standard forms with raw improvisation during meditation. He sensed Anakin's mind racing ahead to imagine victories or remembered losses. Impatience surfaced when assignments felt too small. Anger flickered when he believed himself underestimated. Attachment appeared whenever the subject of his mother or the former Queen of Naboo slipped into conversation. Yoda's responses came in fragments, short walks through the temple gardens, quiet remarks at the end of council briefings, and brief cryptic conversations that ended before Anakin could fully argue a point. Fear leads to anger. He would remind the Padawan loss is the path the living must walk. Let go of what cannot remain. These were not formal lessons, but warnings dropped into Anakin's path like small stones before a cliff. From his vantage point, Yoda saw the danger, but not its final shape. He recognized that Anakin stood closer to the emotional edge than most Jedi, yet trusted that discipline would shape the boy into balance after all. For thousands of years, the Order had taken in the broken, the orphaned, the angry, and turned them toward the light side. What followed was usually a life of service and calm. Why should this be different? The answer lay not only in Anakin, but in the structure around him. The Jedi Order at this time had grown rigid, its codes refined for peacetime guardianship rather than for handling a prodigy. Torn between attachment and destiny, Yoda's wisdom met the resistance of tradition. Missions were assigned, promotions debated, emotions discouraged. The institution moved slowly, even as Anakin's inner conflict accelerated over time. This gap widened. Yoda sensed storms in the Force, but the Council's responses remained procedural. They monitored, they advised, they trusted the old methods to hold. Yet beyond Coruscant, the galactic situation darkened. Separatist movements grew. The Republic drifted toward open war, and the one Jedi least suited to a life of restrained detachment was maturing into a commander. When the Clone Wars finally erupted, and Anakin was given troops, starships, and the praise of a grateful Republic, the scenario Yoda most feared quietly arrived. A gifted but unstable knight, armed with power in a galaxy at war. The unresolved tensions of these quiet years would shape everything that came next. Geonosis. When peacekeepers become generals, when the Clone Wars finally erupted, and Anakin was given troops, starships, and the praise of a grateful Republic, the scenario Yoda most feared quietly arrived. A gifted but unstable knight, armed with power in a galaxy at war. The unresolved tensions of these quiet years would shape everything that came next. The first test came on a dusty red world at the edge of Republic authority. Geonosis. There, Obi-Wan Kenobi tracked a bounty hunter through storm and secrecy, only to uncover a gathering of separatist leaders and a secret droid foundry. When he was captured and sentenced to execution, Anakin and Padme rushed to rescue him. Their courage turned a covert mission into a public spectacle. 3 figures chained in an arena before a roaring Geonosian crowd as beasts closed in and the sand drank fear. What followed was the largest Jedi deployment in generations. More than 200 Jedi arrived to attempt a surgical rescue. They descended into the arena, expecting a swift extraction. Instead, blaster fire erupted from every balcony. Droids poured in waves across the stone floor. One by one, Jedi fell in the dust. The Order that had spent for thousands of years as guardians and negotiators suddenly found itself in the center of a mechanized slaughter, far above the planet. Yoda arrived not in a lone starfighter, but at the head of a newly revealed army. The clone troopers engineered on Kamino marched with perfect discipline, white armor gleaming against the rust-colored world as dropships opened their doors. The small green Grand Master stood at the heart of a storm, calm eyes, watching gunships sweep low over the spires. The image was surreal. A Jedi sage who once counseled patience, now directing artillery and troop movements as if born to command inside Yoda. There was no triumph, only unease. The clones had been bred for obedience, created to die on command, their minds shaped for war rather than contemplation. Every battalion that marched at his order whispered a quiet accusation in the Force. The Jedi had not asked for this army, yet they now accepted its service. An entire generation of soldiers with no childhood, no future beyond the battlefield. The story of their existence pressed against Yoda's conscience with every order given, yet the separatist threat was real. The Republic stood on the brink of collapse, and the dark side coiled around the Senate chambers. Yoda reasoned that refusing command would abandon countless worlds to chaos over time. He convinced himself that the Jedi could remain servants of the light side, even while directing legions in battle, that they could guide this war toward a swift and merciful end. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. As the dust settled on Geonosis, the Jedi counted their dead and watched clone troopers load into transports for the next campaign. The point of no return had passed from this arena. The Clone Wars spread across the stars, and the ancient traditions of the Jedi Order began to bend under the weight of a galactic conflict they had never wanted somewhere in the shadows. Another presence watched Geonosis, and what they found there would change everything. The Clone Wars, a general's burden from Geonosis onward. The Jedi were no longer distant guardians. They were generals' power in the Republic had shifted from debate in the Senate to deployment on the front lines, and the Order followed that shift into War Yoda, who had once spent his days guiding younglings in quiet training rooms now, sat over holographic battle maps, assigning fleets and armies to distant worlds. Entire campaigns moved at the nod of his head during those early months. What followed was a transformation of the Jedi Council chamber into a war room. Yoda coordinated assaults on Munalinst and Hyperi, planned defenses around Kamino and Kashyyyk, and approved missions that sent knights and Padawans into the heart of the galactic conflict, far from the temple. He arrived in gunships instead of meditation chambers, his small form at the head of legions of white-armored clone troopers bred for war and obedience on the surface. It resembled the rise of an ancient martial order. Yet the story of Yoda in the Clone Wars was not only about strategy. It was about how he looked at the soldiers who marched beside him on the icy world of Elam. He listened patiently as clone officers voiced their fears, rather than dismissing them as expendable assets on Ragosa. When a small clone unit showed initiative and courage, he praised them as individuals, calling them by name and reminding them that in the Force all living beings were connected. Over time, these encounters revealed something important. Yoda understood that the clones were not merely tools of the Republic, but sentient lives compressed into accelerated years. In one quiet moment aboard a cruiser, he walked among sleeping troopers, sensing their dreams through the Force. He felt pride, anxiety, and a longing for identity in an empire that would never acknowledge them as more than numbers. His compassion stood in contrast to the cold efficiency of the war machine around him. Yet the longer the conflict continued, the more his concern deepened. Battles won did not bring peace. They only moved the front lines. Yoda began to sense that the entire war was a trap, a vast design meant to exhaust the Jedi and bind them to politics. Every victory in the field pulled the Order further from its spiritual roots. Every council report sounded less like a discussion of the light side, and more like a briefing from a military high command to seek clarity. He turned inward on Coruscant. He retreated to secluded meditation chambers and listened to the currents of the Force on distant battlefields. He sat alone beneath foreign stars, entering deep trances, trying to discern the hidden hand guiding events. Why did the dark side feel stronger after every apparent triumph of the Republic? Why did the Sith remain unseen when their influence was everywhere? A pattern interrupt came when strange whispers reached him from beyond ordinary perception. Voices that hinted at futures clouded by darkness. This drove him to search for deeper guidance than any council meeting could provide. The emotional weight was immense. A 900-year-old master watching yet another age descend into war. But this time, his own order stood at the center of the storm. The burden of each life and death decision pressed on him as the Clone Wars dragged on, and what they found there would change everything again in ways even Yoda could not yet fully see. The lost missions, visions of what's coming, In the midst of that gathering storm, something impossible began to whisper through the Force, a voice long gone yet unmistakable. Qui-Gon Jinn calling to Yoda from beyond death. The Jedi believed that when life ended, even for a great master, the consciousness dissolved back into the cosmic force. So what did it mean when a fallen Jedi spoke from the other side? The answer would shape everything that followed in the quiet chambers of the temple. Yoda meditated and heard that voice again, calm, insistent, guiding him away from the crowded corridors of Coruscant toward a distant, forgotten place. The Council tested for deception. They found no Sith trace, yet no explanations either. Their greatest scholar of the Force confronted a mystery that defied every doctrine he had helped write. Over time, the whispers became a path, and Yoda chose to follow it in secret. His journey led him first to a world he had never seen yet, would one day call home Dagobah, a remote swamp choked with life and shrouded in the Force there. In the mists, Qui-Gon appeared only as disembodied light-side presence, unable to fully manifest, but able to guide Yoda deeper into the planet's tangled heart. What they found there would change everything. A nexus where life and decay blended together. A place strong enough in the Force to hide even from the Sith from Dagobah. The trail carried him further to an ancient world beyond maps. The realm of the Force priestesses, beings who seemed to exist half in reality, half in vision. They offered Yoda trials, not of combat, but of self-revelation in caverns and illusions. He confronted his own fear. The image of a dark, twisted Yoda, born from centuries of war and doubt. He faced his anger at the coming suffering of the Jedi, and his attachment to the Order he had led for hundreds of years. What followed was a series of visions that tore away comforting illusions. The priestesses showed him temples in ruin, Jedi cut down by familiar clone armor, a new empire rising under a dark emperor who bent the galactic order to his will. Yoda saw the Jedi branded traitors. Their light scattered their legacy, buried under steel and marching stormtroopers. He understood that the Republic's war was already feeding the dark side, and that victory on the battlefield would not stop what was coming yet. Amid that despair, another path opened. The priestesses revealed the deepest secret of the Force, the possibility of retaining consciousness after death through complete surrender to the light side guided by Qui-Gon's example. Yoda learned the first steps, a discipline of letting go of self-power and reputation so that identity could endure within the Force itself. This was not immortality through domination as the Sith sought, but persistence through harmony. When Yoda finally returned to Coruscant, the war still raged, the Council still debated, but his gaze had changed. He now moved through strategy meetings and battle reports with the quiet knowledge that the Jedi Order might not survive. He also knew that this act of mercy would reshape galactic history. Mercy not in sparing an enemy, but in preparing a future student who could carry the light after the temple fell. The path to that meeting was set, even as the Clone Wars marched toward their end. Anakin's fall, a failure. Foreseen, too late power can warn, but it can also arrive too late when the Force whispers of danger. The question becomes whether its servants are willing to hear it. The answer in the final days of the Republic is the story of Yoda watching a prophecy fulfilled in the worst possible way. By the time of the Clone Wars, Yoda had already seen fear destroy countless Jedi. Yet in Anakin Skywalker, he sensed a concentration of attachment that unsettled even him. Over time, council chambers heard the same quiet refrain from the Grand Master. Fear of loss leads to the dark side when Anakin came to him in Revenge of the Sith, tormented by visions of death. Yoda's counsel remained consistent. Train oneself to let go of everything one fears to lose. This was pure Jedi doctrine, the distilled wisdom of for thousands of years of ascetic practice. But what followed was a moment where doctrine failed to touch a human heart. Anakin did not arrive as a calm knight, seeking abstract guidance. He came as a desperate husband and haunted former slave. Hearing that he should simply release, his fear did not soothe him. It confirmed a suspicion that had grown since childhood. that the Jedi Order could not truly understand the chains he carried from Tatooine. The result was not peace, but isolation. Into that isolation stepped Chancellor Palpatine. During those same days, Yoda's attention was pulled outward across a galactic war. He felt the dark side thickening around the Senate. Yet the Chancellor had wrapped himself in legality and charm. Every request for emergency power came through proper channels. Every public act appeared measured. Yoda's meditations showed a shrouded future, but not the hidden Sith name at its center. Only late, far too late, did scattered clues begin to converge, the clone army's obedience chips. Kaminoan secrecy, the Chancellor's private interest in Anakin, what they found there would change everything. But the realization came as the trap closed. When Order 66 was issued, the Force itself seemed to scream. On Kashyyyk, Yoda staggered as thousands of Jedi presences were snuffed out in an instant night. He had watched grow from uncertain younglings, masters he had sparred with for centuries. Even children whose first training sabers he had guided all vanished into a single wave of silence. This was no distant military setback. It was the collapse of an entire spiritual lineage that would shape the rest of his life, as failure within that storm. Anakin's fall cut deepest. Yoda had never been his direct master, yet he had argued to keep the boy in the order he had watched the Council place him near the Chancellor. He had offered only austere warnings when compassion and specificity were needed in his quiet reflections after the Temple massacre. Anakin was not only Darth Vader, he was a question: did the Jedi lose him or fail to reach him? The answer to that question would decide what Yoda chose to do next and who he chose to wait for in exile. Duel in the Senate, facing Darth Sidious. In the end, the answer he found did not lead him back to the council chambers. It led him to the very heart of the new empire's power, the great galactic Senate itself. Once the arena of debate and law, now hollowed out into a cathedral of authority power, had shifted, and the Force seemed to whisper that the truth of that shift waited there. It was night on Coruscant. The Senate chamber lay almost empty, its countless floating pods resting in darkness. Only a few glowed dimly, suspended in the vast sphere above the central podium. The flicker of emergency lights painted the room in alternating bands of shadow and dull red. This was the symbolic stage, for what followed was a confrontation between the Republic's highest office and the Jedi's Grand Master, between the face of the Empire and the last defender of the old order. Palpatine stood on the Chancellor's podium, now the throne of a Sith Lord, his robes draped easily, as if this were another routine session of procedure. When Yoda stepped into the light, the contrast was stark. A small figure, leaning on a cane, against the towering machinery of galactic government. The story of this duel would shape how the Force moved in the years to come. But in that first quiet moment, there was only recognition. The mask and the monster behind it finally seen together. The battle began, not with shouting, but with a simple decision. Yoda raised his hand. Sidious answered with a storm of Force lightning. The air crackled blue-white around the tiny Jedi as he absorbed and deflected the dark side's fury. Then the blades appeared green and red, washing the central platform in their glow. Their clash echoed through the empty chamber, each impact a reminder of a war already lost above them. The Senate pods stirred under Sidious's command. They became weapons torn free and hurled in wide arcs across the cavernous space. Yoda moved with the agility that had surprised droids on Geonosis and clones on Kashyyyk, leaping from pod to pod, turning the open air into a shifting battlefield. Sidious countered with cruelty, laughing as he ripped entire delegations' platforms from their moorings and sent them spinning into the void. What they found there would change everything. The Senate itself became shrapnel democracy, reduced to falling debris in a private duel between Jedi and Sith. The tipping point came suddenly a surge of lightning, a misjudged angle. Yoda caught Sidious's attack and tried to turn it back. The chamber flashed with blinding light. The explosion hurled them apart. Yoda's lightsaber spun away into the J-Bis. He struck the edge of a pod. Hard fingers scrabbling for purchase hanging above the darkness below. In that suspended moment he understood the truth. This conflict could not be won by strength or skill. The dark side had already wrapped itself around institutions, armies, and fear the Jedi had lost this battle over time. Their warnings had gone unheard, their vision clouded. His role must change from warrior to guardian of a future he could no longer see clearly, only trust. Quietly, he released the fight. He allowed the pod to carry him away from the center of the chamber, while Sidious clawed his way upward to the highest point of power. Yoda slipped downward into maintenance shafts, service corridors, and forgotten passages. The bright Senate dome gave way to dripping pipes, flickering panels, and the endless underlevels of Coruscant. There in the shadows, a small cloaked figure disappeared as an empire was born above him, and the next chapter of the Force waited in exile, the last council. Planning the vanishing. In the darkness beneath Coruscant's shining towers, Yoda emerged again. Not into battle, but into aftermath. Power had shifted in a single day. The Jedi Order shattered the Republic dead in all but name, the new Empire, tightening around the galaxy. While the smoke still rose from the temple, he did not return to the grand halls he had once ruled. Instead, he went where the last threads of hope were gathering, a secret medical facility hidden among the city's endless structures there. Bail Organa had brought Padme Amidala there. Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived with the weight of Mustafar still on his robes, and there, the story of the Jedi's last council quietly unfolded inside that sterile chamber. The sounds of war were replaced by the soft rhythm of medical machines. Padme lay dying, her body broken by loss and betrayal. Yet within her the Force still moved in one final act of creation. Twins Luke and Leia Skywalker. What followed was not a triumphant celebration of birth, but a desperate calculation of survival. The question was simple, yet terrible. How could these children live in a galaxy now ruled by their father and his Sith master? The answer would shape everything that followed. Yoda Bail and Obi-Wan understood that as long as Sidious hunted the remnants of the Jedi, any open resistance would end at the Emperor's throne room. In failure, the Empire's power was absolute, in fleets, in soldiers, in fear. So they chose to fight in a different way, by not fighting at all. Not yet Yoda read the currents of the Force and saw only darkness in direct confrontation. A scattered hunted order could not defeat a Sith-controlled empire. Head-on continued war would mean the extinction of the light side itself over time. Even the memory of the Jedi could be erased. Instead, they turned to secrecy. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. The twins would be separated, hidden, even from one another, hidden from their father, Luke entrusted to Owen and Beru Lars on Tatooine. Under the quiet watch of Obi-Wan Leia, adopted into the royal house of Alderaan, raised as Bail Organa's daughter in the heart of politics that had failed her mother for Yoda, the decision went further than strategy. It was an act of faith. Exile would not be surrender, but patience. He would vanish from the galactic stage and trust that the Force would one day present a new hope. His role was no longer to command armies, but to survive, to wait, and to teach when the time finally came. So he searched for a world strong in the Force, yet cloaked from Sith perception, a place where life and decay intertwined so deeply that a single presence could vanish within it. What they found there would change everything. A remote swamp world on the galactic fringe, a name whispered only in later legends, Dagobah, choosing the swamp. Why Dagobah? Dagobah was not a world of shining cities or ancient temples. It was a whisper at the edge of star charts, a forgotten knot of wetlands and storms on the galactic. Fringe power in the Force does not always announce itself with monuments and armies. Sometimes it hides in mud and mist on Dagobah. The air hung heavy with moisture. Thick mists curled around gnarled trees whose roots clawed into black water. The ground sank and shifted with each step. Insects traced lazy spirals through the haze, their constant buzzing weaving a soft curtain of sound from high branches. Unseen creatures called to one another, while from above the slow drip of water fell from leaf to leaf until it vanished into the pools below. Time that did not feel linear. It felt circular, an endless cycle of rain growth, decay, and rebirth for a master who had survived the fall of the Jedi and the rise of a Sith Empire. This was not an accident. It was design. Dagobah was overwhelmingly strong in the living force. Every patch of moss, every flicker of amphibian eyes in the dark, every unseen root system thrumming beneath the surface added to a dense field of presence in that storm of life. One small signature vanished, a single candle hidden within a roaring bonfire. The Sith searched the stars for surviving Jedi, but their perception was dulled here, overwhelmed by the chorus of the swamp. Yet Dagobah was not purely gentle. Beneath its surface lay a wound in the Force, a cave where the dark side pooled cold, and patient some believed it was an ancient vergence, a place where the barrier between visions and reality thinned. What followed was a quiet equilibrium, the light side saturating the teeming wetlands, the dark side coiled in the depths of the cave. Together, they created a balance that would shape the last chapter of Yoda's story. The contrast to Coruscant could not have been sharper. Once Yoda had walked beneath the gleaming towers of the galactic capital, presiding over marble halls and endless skylanes, his presence had been public ceremonial, a symbol of the Jedi Order at the height of its power on Dagobah. His world shrank to mud and roots, to the cramped interior of a crude hut and the tangled silhouettes of trees against a stormy sky. The story of the Grand Master became the story of an anonymous hermit. Over time, this retreat became more than hiding from Sith hunters. It was a kind of penance and a form of rest after decades of war and political conflict. The quiet cycles of growth and decay offered a different teaching than any council chamber could. Leaves fell and returned, water rose and sank. Creatures hunted and were hunted in this endless rhythm. Yoda meditated on failure, regret, and the possibility of renewal. And somewhere in that swamp, he waited for the next disturbance in the Force, the one that would bring a Skywalker to his door. Years of silence, life in exile in the years that followed, that first quiet night on Dagobah. Power and glory belonged to distant stars, not to the small figure moving through the mist. Each morning began the same way. Damp air clung to Yoda's robes as he eased open the crooked door of his hut. The swamp greeted him with a low chorus of insects and distant creatures, and in that sound he heard the steady breathing of the Force to survive. He returned to tasks so simple. They barely seemed worthy of the former Grand Master of the Jedi Order. Before the rise of the Empire, he had commanded legions and council chancellors. Now he picked his way over tangled roots, searching for edible fungi, scraping moss from stones and collecting gnarled roots from beneath stagnant pools. He gathered bundles of dry reeds for a small fire, arranging them with the same care once given to galactic strategy. Around midday, he would sit outside the hut, steam curling from a crude pot as he stirred his thin stew. The old lightsaber at his belt stayed mostly untouched, its power now symbolic rather than practical. In the reflection on the water, he sometimes saw the great halls of the Jedi Temple, polished floors and towering statues replaced by mud and hanging vines. Expectation said such a fall should have broken him. The reality was slower and more complicated. During long afternoons, he meditated in the hollow beside his home. Eyes closed, breath shallow in that stillness. The past returned the council chamber where he had doubted Anakin Skywalker, yet allowed the war to grind on the moment on Coruscant when he felt the dark side surge and realized too late that the Sith had already won. What followed was years of quiet self-examination. He turned those memories over again and again. At first they were blades, then they became lessons over time. Self-reproach gave way to a harder acceptance. He had misread the currents of the Force. He had trusted institutions that had grown rigid and blind, but he had also protected countless worlds for thousands of years and guided generations of Jedi whose names were already fading into history. In the swamp's endless cycle of decay and renewal, he found a reflection of his own failure and the possibility of balance beyond victory or defeat in the deepest hours of night when fog or rolled thick over the water. Yoda reached out into the living force there. In that luminous silence, he communed with presences that no longer possessed bodies. The first was still often Qui-Gon Jinn patient, insistent, guiding him through the mysteries of consciousness beyond death. Other voices came less often. Ancient Jedi who had watched earlier empires rise and fall together. They refined secret disciplines that would shape what came after his final breath. Loneliness never fully left him. He had outlived almost everyone he had known. The laughter of younglings in the temple, the debates of the council, the roar of clone trooper gunships, all of it reduced to echoes, yet without the burden of command, without war reports and endless petitions, there was also peace. He answered only to the Force and to the quiet needs of each day years, blurred Dagobah's seasons, measured not by calendars, but by the growth of roots through his walls and the deepening lines on his ancient face, and beneath that, slow erosion. Something else formed, awaiting, not passive but focused. He felt every faint tremor in the Force, every distant ripple of conflict beyond the clouds. And then one day, a sharper disturbance brushed the edge of his awareness, a presence tangled in fear and hope, a Skywalker again drawing near. A new hope ignites. Watching from afar, the Force binds all things. But what happens when a great master can touch that current, yet remain unable to move within it? The answer is the quiet vigil of Yoda in exile on Dagobah. Time lost its edges. Seasons bled together in mist and rain. Yet the galaxy beyond did not sleep over time. Distant storms pressed against the old master's awareness. The Force carried echoes across light years, a planet's fear, a fleet's sudden silence, whole bloodlines bending toward darkness and light side by side. When the Death Star fired on Alderaan, the blast did not reach the swamp, but the wound it tore through hyperspace as a silent scream, a pressure in the air that made the trees shudder. Yoda paused in his walking stick's slow arc, his eyes closing, as millions of lives vanished in an instant. This was not the chaos of the Clone War. This was colder, more precise, an empire wielding power as terror, rather than as open conflict. From that moment, what followed was a steady tightening of the cord that linked him to the wider galactic struggle. He felt Darth Vader's presence grow heavier in the current, a dark weight dragging whole star systems into fear. The apprentice he had failed to save now served as the sharpest blade of the Sith. Every new atrocity left a faint bruise along the edges of his perception, and yet within that gathering shadow, a smaller light began to flicker. At first, it was only a distant spark, a farm boy's restlessness on Tatooine, a pilot's sudden clarity in the trench above Yavin. But the signature in the Force was unmistakable. The Skywalker line had not ended in fire. It had divided one child consumed by the dark side, another rising toward the light side, without understanding why. In those years, Yoda was not entirely alone. Obi-Wan Kenobi, now one with the Force, moved as a calm presence just beyond sight. Their communication was not conversation. In the ordinary sense, it was alignment, a shared intention that would shape the path of a single life. Kenobi watched over Luke directly, while Yoda waited further downstream, trusting that the current would carry the boy to him. When the time was right, hope did not come easily. The story of Anakin Skywalker remained a fresh wound. The Skywalkers brought immense potential, but also a gravity toward extremes in quiet moments. Yoda weighed possibilities, a new Jedi champion, or a second fall that might end the Order forever. This was the pattern, interrupt in his long certainty, the realization that the old ways could not simply be restored, so he did not reach out to command fleets or turn battles in the rebellion's favor. X-Wings rose and burned without his intervention. Senators argued and vanished from the Holonet worlds, traded one occupation for another. Yoda listened and chose stillness. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. Mercy, not only for his enemies, but for the future itself, by allowing others to choose their own path. Over time, the disturbances narrowed from star systems to a single presence. Fear in a cockpit over Hoth's stubborn resolve in the cold of space, an X-Wing's uncontrolled descent through cloud and storm, hurtling toward the very swamp that had hidden him for decades. What they found there would change everything. A young pilot soaked in mud, an old master watching from the shadows, and the quiet question of whether to reveal the truth or remain a ghost. Soon Dagobah would no longer be only a place of exile. It would become a classroom, a crucible, and the final stage on which Yoda would pass on the last lessons of a dying age, the visitor in the swamp, testing Luke in the murk of Dagobah's twilight. The question of power took on a quieter form. Not starfleets or Senate decrees, but a single failing starfighter sinking into a nameless swamp. This was where the story of the last Skywalker's training truly began. Luke's X-wing crashed through the canopy and came to rest half buried in mud. Steam hissed from damaged engines, rain pattered on the fuselage, and the thick air glowed with bioluminescent insects. R2. D2 tumbled into the water, vanishing beneath the surface before popping back up with anxious chirps and whistles as the little astromech struggled. A small figure watched from the shadows, half hidden by roots and hanging moss. The Force stirred around that presence. Ancient calm and measuring for decades, Dagobah had been a place of exile. Now it became a stage. Yoda stood there, cloaked in mud and vines, listening to Luke complain about the mission, the conditions, the impossibility of finding a great warrior in such a forgotten corner of the galactic frontier. Expectation said a Jedi Master should arrive in robes and light, should blaze around a beacon of power. Yoda chose the opposite. What followed was a deliberate performance. The ancient Grand Master shuffled into the camp, muttering and fussing. He dug through supply crates, stole food, poked at R2 with his Geimer stick, and spoke in riddles and complaints. His voice high, his manner mischievous. Even annoying, this was not deception for its own sake. It was a test of patience, humility, and imagination. Could this young pilot see, beyond appearances, beyond the outer shell of power that had dazzled so many during the Clone Wars? Luke's answers came quickly and without words, frustration in his tone. When Yoda delayed anger, when his equipment was disturbed, dismissal when the stranger dared to touch a lightsaber, he treated the visitor as an obstacle, not a teacher. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. He chased external strength. He wanted techniques and abilities the way Anakin had once wanted promotions and victories. The same impatience that had driven the Republic toward war now flickered in a single, restless student. Yoda watched every reaction behind the act. His eyes were clear. He remembered council chambers filled with confident Jedi, remembered how the Order had misjudged the dark side that grew inside Anakin Skywalker, and he weighed a new risk to train another Skywalker. And all this act of mercy would reshape galactic history if it succeeded, but only if the mistakes of the past were not repeated. At last, in the cramped hut, the mask dropped. Yoda's tone shifted, the mischief fell away, and the full weight of centuries entered his voice. He spoke as master, not as fool. The air seemed to tighten around the words, and from the unseen currents of the Force came Obi-Wan's familiar presence, confirming the truth. This was Yoda. This was the teacher Luke had crossed the stars to find, and what they found there would change everything for the next 1,000 years of Jedi memory. In that moment, the long wait ended. The exile, the silence, the years of replaying old failures all coalesced into a single choice. Yoda would try again, with one student to correct what had been lost with another. Luke's true training was about to begin, and the swamp that had hidden the past would now reveal the last lessons of a dying age, lifting X-wings and old burdens. Luke's training on Dagobah began not with grand temples or shining arenas, but with mud, fog, and exhaustion. Power in the Force, Yoda believed, had to be grounded in humility, in breath and heartbeat, before it could touch the stars. The story of this training would shape not only one young Jedi, but the final years of an old master who carried centuries of failure on his back. Day after day, Luke ran through the swamp with Yoda perched between his shoulders, a small green weight that represented an entire fallen order. Around them, Dagobah's life teemed and whispered, the Force pressing in from every root and insect. Yoda drove him harder, urging sprints through tangled vines, sudden climbs over gnarled roots, and leaps across stagnant pools. Each command was simple, almost harsh, but underneath lay a quiet desperation. This had to work. Over time, those runs became a living meditation, a moving lesson in surrendering control while still pushing the body to its limits. Then came the balancing. Luke inverted himself on one hand, the other arm outstretched, stones and crates orbiting him in a slow, trembling dance. Yoda watched in silence, staff across his knees, listening not to Luke's words but to the ripples in the Force. When distraction broke Luke's focus and everything crashed down, Yoda saw echoes of temple training halls on Coruscant, of younglings who had once faltered before rising again. Failure, he knew now, was not a detour. It was the path. The sunken X-Wing turned that philosophy into a single, unforgettable trial. Marred in the swamp, the starfighter was a monument to Luke's fear and disbelief. When Yoda urged him to lift it, Luke's response was the same answer the Jedi had given, in their own way, for thousands of years, that something so large, so impossible, lay beyond reach. Yoda's quiet rebuke, "Judge me by my size, do you?" carried the weight of his entire life as a small being who had once led a galactic order. Size, rank, even reputation meant nothing. Only the Force. What followed was a demonstration, not of physical strength, but of absolute trust. Yoda closed his eyes, reached out, and the X-Wing rose, dripping and groaning on a tide of invisible will. Luke's astonishment, "I don't believe it," earned the soft, devastating reply, "That is why you fail." In that moment, Yoda rejected faith in the self as the primary source of power. True mastery meant faith in the Force itself, beyond ego, beyond fear. Yet every lesson carried shadows. Yoda warned Luke about the dark side, about how anger and attachment could twist noble intentions into catastrophic choices. The memory of Anakin's fall, of a war that had shattered the Jedi and empowered the Sith, lingered behind every caution against rushing into conflict. He had seen a promising knight throw everything away to save those he loved, and, in doing so, doom them. So when visions of Han and Leia in pain tore at Luke, Yoda faced the same crossroads the Council had once faced with Anakin. He urged patience, completion of training, trust in the Force over immediate rescue. But Luke, burning with urgency, would soon choose to leave early. In that decision, Yoda was forced to accept a final, bitter truth. Even the greatest master could only point toward the path. The next step, and the consequences that followed, would belong to the student alone. And as Luke's X-Wing engines prepared to roar back to life, the swamp grew very quiet. Because somewhere in the Force, another presence was waiting, and the confrontation that came next would test every lesson Dagobah had tried. To teach. Letting him go. Luke's premature departure. The engines had not yet ignited, but the decision had already been made. In the misty half-light of Dagobah, Luke Skywalker stood on the edge between duty and attachment. Through the Force, he felt a sharp, searing vision of his friends in Cloud City, suspended in pain and terror. Power corrupts. But what happens when that power is bound to the fear of losing those held most dear? The answer, Yoda knew too well, was the path that had once led Anakin Skywalker into the dark. Around 2 decades earlier, a younger, more certain Yoda had watched Anakin face similar storms. Then, the Council had tightened its grip. No attachment, no deviation, no trust in the learner's own journey. Anakin's nightmares of his mother, his terror over Padmé's fate, had been met with doctrine and distance. What followed was a tragedy that shattered the Jedi and allowed the Sith to claim a galactic empire. Now on Dagobah, the pattern, returned. Luke's training was incomplete. His skills with the lightsaber were raw, his sense of the Force still unsteady. Yoda warned him that if he faced Vader prematurely, he would risk everything: his life, his soul, the fragile hope of the light side. Obi-Wan's disembodied voice joined in, urging patience, insisting that sacrifice might be necessary. Yet Luke's answer was the same one Anakin had once carried in his heart. He would not abandon those he loved. Here, the story of Yoda turned. The old Grand Master could have tried to forbid him to command obedience the way the High Council once did in the marble halls of Coruscant. Instead, he stepped back. Over time, exile had carved humility into him. He understood that rigid control would shape another disaster. Overprotectiveness had not saved Anakin. It had helped doom him. So Yoda allowed Luke to go. Not because the danger had lessened, but because his faith had shifted. He trusted more in the will of the Force than in his own judgment. In that swamp, the most powerful surviving Jedi silently admitted that the future of the Order could not be micromanaged into perfection. True growth required the freedom to risk failure, even to risk falling. The cost of that choice was not abstract. Yoda felt the pain of it in his small, tired body, in the way his ears drooped as the X-Wing rose from the mud. He knew Luke might die on Bespin. He knew Vader might twist him, turning the last Skywalker into another weapon of the dark side. Yet he did not call the ship back. Then came the pattern interrupt that defined the end of his old era. Instead of clinging, Yoda planted a final, quiet seed. He reminded Luke to remember what he had learned, to trust the Force, to let calm guide him in the storm ahead. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history because it balanced warning with trust. Unlike with Anakin, the door was left open for a return. And when the X-Wing vanished into the clouds, Yoda turned back into the depths of the swamp, already sensing that the next time Luke came to Dagobah, he would not arrive as an impulsive student, but as something far more dangerous and far more necessary, a Jedi on the edge of understanding. A fading flame. Yoda's final days. When Luke returned to Dagobah the second time, the swamp felt different. The same mists curled through the trees, the same distant creatures called in the dark, yet there was a stillness beneath it all, a sense that something long in motion was finally coming to rest in the small clearing. Yoda's hut glowed with a dim, amber light, a single low fire pushing back the shadows rather than inviting them in inside. The story of their training had become the story of a farewell. The cramped space was unchanged, cluttered with pots, roots, and simple tools. But the center of it all had shifted. The old master lay under rough blankets on his narrow bed, smaller than memory, his form almost swallowed by the furs Luke entered not as the impulsive apprentice who had fled to Bespin, but as a calmer, steadier figure. The war had marked him, and over time the boy had begun to resemble the Jedi Yoda had once hoped the Order might still produce Yoda's body. However, bore the full weight of 9 centuries. The cough that shook him was thin but deep. Each breath and effort, his hands trembled as he tried to sit, the motion slow, deliberate, as though the gravity of the entire galactic conflict pressed on his shoulders, yet his eyes remained clear, sharp with understanding. And when he spoke, the warmth in his voice cut gently through the dim air. Luke's questions were simple, but their answers would shape everything at last. Yoda confirmed what the dark side had already whispered on Bespin. Darth Vader was indeed Anakin Skywalker, Luke's father. There was no comforting half-truth, no attempt to soften the blow instead. Yoda turned at once to duty. The Jedi had failed Anakin, but the son still had a choice. Luke must confront Vader again, not in hatred, but in necessary courage. And beneath that heavy command, Yoda offered a final, quiet thread of hope. There was another Skywalker, a single phrase that hinted at Leia, at a future beyond any single bloodline, beyond any single war. In those fading moments, Yoda's last lesson was not about power, but about failure. He admitted in his own way that even centuries of wisdom had not prevented the fall of the Jedi. The Sith had risen within sight of the temple's spires, and the Order had not seen the storm until it broke. Yet this was not a confession of despair. It was a reminder that the light side did not belong to the unbroken. It belonged to those who learned, who accepted that mistakes, even on a galactic scale, could become foundations rather than prisons. When the fire in the hearth sank to embers, the fire in Yoda's body finally followed. What followed was not dramatic. No clash of blades, no thunder of the Empire's guns. His breathing slowed, his words grew softer, and then, with a final blessing for Luke's path, his small form simply relaxed into the Force. His body vanished, robes falling empty upon the bed. The hut did not feel abandoned. Instead, it felt as if a long-held breath had finally been released, the air clearer, the silence deeper, and somewhere just beyond hearing, the living Force stirred, already preparing to speak again. Luminous afterlife. Yoda as a Force spirit in the stillness that followed Yoda's passing. The hut on Dagobah felt empty only in a physical sense. The Jedi taught that the Force bound all living things. But what happens when a great Jedi's consciousness refuses to fade into that vast current? The answer is the mystery of the luminous spirits of the Force. For thousands of years, most Jedi expected to dissolve into the cosmic force, their individuality surrendered to a greater harmony. But a hidden doctrine spoke of another path through arduous training and profound surrender. Few learned to retain awareness after death. They did not cling to life in fear. Rather, they stepped beyond it, becoming radiant impressions within the living Force. This was not immortality in the Sith sense. No empire of the self, no dark side defiance against nature. Instead, it was a quiet survival through compassion, clarity, and acceptance. Yoda's journey into this state began long before his final breath. In the Clone Wars, he followed cryptic whispers through ancient temples and shadowed worlds. What they found there would change everything. He confronted visions of the Sith, triumphant of Jedi temples in ruins, and his own failures laid bare, guided by enigmatic Force priestesses. He learned that only one who had faced fear without attachment could learn to let go so completely that the self might endure without a body. When Luke Skywalker later gazed into the Endor night and saw three familiar figures standing in the soft glow of celebration, what followed was a quiet revelation. Yoda stood beside Obi-Wan and the redeemed Anakin Skywalker, the story of the galactic conflict condensed into three luminous forms: Master, Mentor, and Fallen Hero. Restored, this simple tableau would shape how the Force was understood. Balance did not erase the past, it transformed it. Enemies became companions through the light side over time. Yoda's presence did not vanish after Endor. He remained watchful, but distant, appearing only when the currents of the Force trembled decades later on Arch. To the old Master found Luke again this time, beside an ancient tree, heavy with Jedi texts, with a gentle gesture and a bolt of summoned lightning. Yoda burned the symbol of that old order, then reminded Luke that failure is the greatest teacher even in death. He was still learning, still revising his understanding of power, responsibility, and legacy. His rare interventions reveal a deeper philosophy. Yoda did not haunt every crossroads he respected. Free will he nudged but did not command, trusting that new generations must choose their own paths. His luminous afterlife completed the arc that began with those Clone Wars visions. He no longer feared a dark future, because he understood that the light side could endure in many forms, embodied in masters, in students, and in the quiet, unseen presence of the Force itself, waiting to guide the next awakening. Legends and lost stories. Yoda, beyond canon. In the quiet that followed his final transformation, another truth emerges. The story of Yoda is not contained only in films and a handful of episodes. It stretches into half-remembered scrolls, game worlds, and novels that whisper about the spaces between the scenes on screen after the Clone Wars and his luminous afterlife. Storytellers turned backward and outward, asking what a 900-year life would truly contain. The answer is not a single fixed timeline, but a constellation of possibilities. Many of these tales belong to what is now called legends, not binding galactic history, yet still powerful in the way they suggest how vast his journey might have been. One such account speaks of Yoda as a young knight traveling far beyond familiar hyperlanes to a mist-wreathed world where the Force pooled in ancient stone circles. There he confronted an entity older than the Republic, a dark side presence that tested his resolve not through war, but through visions of failure and pride. What followed was a long night of trial in which he chose humility over power and left the world unchanged on the surface, yet forever altered within a different legend, places him on the frontiers of a forgotten empire, centuries before the Clone Wars, moving quietly among refugee camps rather than battlefields. In that telling, he trains no famous council members, only nameless guardians who defend a single moon from pirates and Sith cultists. Their deeds vanish from official records, but the calm courage he awakens in them would shape the safety of an entire sector for generations over time. Other stories emerge of Yoda, walking rain-soaked streets on distant Ecumenopolis worlds, listening more than speaking of him, mediating feuds between rival Jedi Masters whose names never reach the films, or guiding a lone Padawan through grief in the shadow of an earlier conflict. Each vignette suggests that for thousands of years, his presence threaded through the galaxy in ways too small for grand chronicles, yet essential to its balance. These legends do not always agree. Some imagine him studying with mysterious Force sects in the depths of the galactic core. Others hint that he once stood at the edge of an ancient dark side fortress and turned away, choosing life over forbidden knowledge. What they found there would change everything in those tales is not a secret weapon, but the realization that even a Grand Master must sometimes accept. Not knowing for this bedtime journey the exact sequence of these events matters less than the feeling they create, a sense that the familiar scenes on Dagobah or in the Jedi Temple are only a few bright stars in a far wider sky. Whether canon or legend, the pattern remains constant. Yoda appears where fear and arrogance threaten to harden into tyranny. He counsels patience. He chooses restraint. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, not through dramatic victories, but through countless quiet decisions to trust the light side when the dark side promised faster answers. And somewhere out beyond the edges of confirmed history, more stories still wait untold, suggesting that the small green master seen on screen may be only one face of a presence that has walked beside the Jedi far longer than anyone remembers, raising the question of what hidden chapter his name might yet appear in next. The weight of 900 years. Over time, the question of Yoda's true age becomes more than a trivia detail. It becomes a lens on the weight of nearly 9 centuries lived under the glow of the same distant stars. What does power mean to a being who has watched empires rise and fall until their banners blur together? The answer is that for Yoda, power becomes almost meaningless. Compared to endurance across 900 years, the galactic stage never stops shifting. Technologies evolve, hyperlanes multiply, and entire fleets pass from primitive metal hulls to sleek star destroyers. Governments proclaim peace before plunging into yet another war. For thousands of years, the Jedi and the Sith trade victories and defeats, and through it all, the small green master remains a constant presence. He watches republics reform, senates restructure, and the Jedi Temple itself rebuilt after earlier conflicts until the stone beneath his feet feels older than memory. The story of such a lifespan is not one of detachment, born from coldness, but of survival of the heart. When every friend ages in fast motion and every Padawan grows old in what feels almost a single breath, attachment becomes a quiet kind of danger, not because love is wrong, but because the pain of loss repeats again and again. What followed was a philosophy that would shape Yoda's every teaching. Accept change, release fear, do not cling to what must pass or be broken by it. Yet this acceptance carries a different burden: loneliness. There is a particular silence in the Jedi Temple at night, when the training sabers are dimmed and the younglings' voices fade. Yoda has heard that silence across centuries, He has watched entire classes come and go, faces blur into lineages, masters training students who train students in turn until he alone remembers. The first generation teaching becomes his answer to that emptiness, his way of remaining connected to the living current of the Force by pouring wisdom forward into minds that will outlast him. But even 900 years do not bring perfection. Despite his age, Yoda misreads the dark currents around Anakin Skywalker. He senses the storm, but not the exact bolt. He underestimates the subtlety of Darth Sidious and the depth of the Sith design that coils beneath the Galactic Senate. This is the pattern interrupt in his legend, the moment when near-mythic wisdom fails and the Jedi Order falls around him, revealing that growth never truly ends. Not even for a Grand Master on Dagobah, surrounded by mist and ancient trees. Yoda carries all of this history. Yet when Luke arrives, he does not speak in bitterness. He laughs, he tests, he adapts what they found. That would change everything for Luke. Not because Yoda is flawless, but because he is still willing to learn. In his final years, his greatness lies not in never falling, but in rising again and turning even failure into a final lesson, passed gently into the light side. Yoda and the Jedi, love, critique, and regret in the quiet that follows Luke's awakening. Another question lingers. What does it mean for a Jedi to love an order that has failed? The answer is the story of Yoda and the Jedi themselves, a bond forged over centuries and tested in the final days of the Republic long before the Clone Wars. Yoda's life was given to the temple. He walked the grand halls as a small figure beneath towering statues, yet his presence carried immense power. For hundreds of years he taught younglings to feel the light side as peace, not as weapon. He believed the Jedi existed to serve the galaxy, to resolve conflict before it became war, and to seek knowledge without possession. Over time, this devotion would shape nearly every tradition in the Order, from the creche to the council chamber, around the era that would later be called the High Republic. Yoda watched the Jedi at their height, starships bearing the Order's symbol, crossed the galactic rim, not as conquerors, but as guardians. He saw temples raised on distant worlds, and children rescued from chaos and given purpose. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. One Padawan at a time, to Yoda the Jedi were proof that discipline and compassion could stand against the dark side, without becoming it yet, as the Republic aged something in the temple. Hardened, Yoda remained Grand Master as the Order drew closer to the Senate, its robes brushing the marble of political power. What followed was a slow narrowing of vision rules, multiplied. Attachment was forbidden, debate was quieted, and prophecy became a puzzle to be solved rather than a warning to be heeded. Yoda felt the Force grow clouded and knew the Jedi had become entangled in a game they did not understand. His position at the summit of that hierarchy made change difficult. The Grand Master, who had trained generations, was also bound by their expectations to question the code. Too sharply would be to question his own life's work. He sensed the dark side moving through the Republic, yet every response passed through councils, procedures and traditions he had helped build the Order, marched into war as generals of a clone army, while Yoda watched wondering at what point defenders had become soldiers. After the fall, his exile on Dagobah became both punishment and release cast into the swamp. He stepped outside the institution for the first time in centuries, surrounded only by mist and the raw living force. He could see with painful clarity where the Jedi had gone astray. In clinging to purity, they had become rigid in seeking to avoid darkness. They had grown blind to it when Luke returned. In later years, Yoda's counsel had softened. He no longer spoke of the Jedi as flawless guardians, but as a tradition that must be renewed, not merely restored. He urged Luke to pass on what he had learned, yet also to confront failure, to let old texts burn if necessary, so that the living force could breathe again. And in that gentle critique lay the path toward a different kind of Jedi, one the next generation would have to define for themselves, the teacher of those we never see. And from that invitation to change, another truth emerges. The story of Yoda is not only the story of famous heroes, it is the story of countless faces that pass through the temple and vanish into the wider galaxy without ever entering recorded legend. Power in the Force rarely announces itself with fanfare. Often it moves quietly in classrooms. Across centuries, the training halls of the Jedi Temple echo with the same measured voice. Morning light spills through high windows, catching dust motes that drift above padded floors and practice remotes. Rows of younglings sit cross-legged, different species, different worlds, different futures, all listening to a small green figure at the center. Over time, they arrive as an unending tide, and what followed was a rhythm as steady as the temple's own heartbeat. Generations in, generations out, waves on a shore. In the age now called the High Republic, these waves become the Jedi who ride gleaming cruisers to the frontier, who negotiate with fractious planetary governments, who answer distress calls in regions the Republic barely maps. Their names are scattered through archives, mission reports, half-remembered anecdotes. Yet behind each one stands the same early presence, the same instructor who once corrected a stance or turned a lesson about levitating stones into a meditation on fear and attachment. Later, during the Clone Wars, that hidden lineage extends into a galactic conflict. Knights and commanders drop from gunships onto worlds that will never appear in any holodrama. On nameless moons, in ruined cities, in the shadow of separatist war machines, a Jedi pauses before striking, remembers a quiet temple courtyard and a warning against anger, and chooses restraint. A blaster is lowered. A surrender is accepted. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history in ways no one present could measure, because it preserves a witness, or spares a child, or plants the first seed of future rebellion against the dark side. Not every legacy is a duel on a hangar bridge, every calm negotiation that averts a war, every healer who stays behind on a plague-stricken world, every knight who chooses to shield civilians rather than pursue an enemy may trace its origin to something Yoda once said, to a frightened child struggling to lift a training sphere. For thousands of years, this unseen pattern would shape the balance between light side and dark side, far from Coruscant's grand debates. Even when the Order falls and the temple burns, those early impressions do not vanish. Scattered survivors carry them into exile, into hiding, into quiet acts of defiance under imperial rule. The Empire can shatter sabers and topple statues, but it cannot erase a memory of patience or a habit of compassion. In that sense, Yoda's influence continues for the next 1,000 years, in spirit if not in name, an invisible current beneath galactic history, still moving long after the stone that started the ripples has sunk beneath Dagobah's still, dark waters. Failure, forgiveness, and the future. Over time, the stillness of Dagobah becomes more than hiding. It becomes a mirror in which Yoda is forced to face the one enemy. He had never truly confronted his own failure. The story of his last decades is not a tale of battles, but of slow, honest reckoning with everything that went wrong under his watch. For centuries before the Clone Wars, Yoda had been the calm center of the Jedi Temple. In those grand halls, he trained younglings in the light side, taught discipline, and warned against fear. Yet when the dark side finally rose in earnest, he misread almost every sign. He failed to see Darth Sidious seated in the heart of the Republic. He allowed the Jedi to become generals in a galactic war, and he watched as the Order transformed from guardians of peace into commanders of an army bred for conflict. The most painful failure came in the form of one troubled boy. When Anakin Skywalker confessed his fears, Yoda answered with doctrine rather than compassion. He spoke of letting go of all that was feared to lose, but did not reach for the deeper wound beneath the words. What followed was the slow unraveling of the chosen one, a path that would shape the entire era as Anakin fell to the dark side and the Sith Empire of one rose in his place. After the Purge, Yoda could have hardened into denial, insisting that the Jedi had done everything correctly. He could have sunk into despair and let the swamp swallow him. Instead, exile becomes his classroom on Dagobah. He sits with the memory of every council vote, every dismissed warning, every clone trooper who turned his blaster on a friend. He chooses reflection, humility, and change. He studies the living force in the buzzing insects and tangled roots, and he listens in the quiet until new understanding finally comes. This is why his teachings to Luke sound so different from the confident pronouncements of the prequel era, when Luke rushes off to Bespin Yoda, recognizes the same impatience that once burned in Anakin, yet there is no rigid lecture, only weary concern by the time of their final meeting. Yoda has distilled a lifetime of loss into a single truth, he tells Luke, that failure is the greatest teacher. Those words do not come from theory. They come from the memory of a fallen temple and a sky filled with burning Jedi ships. Through this acceptance, Yoda remains a source of hope rather than a monument to guilt. His regrets become warnings. His mistakes become maps. He does not deny his part in galactic history, but he refuses to let that history end with him. This quiet courage, accepting responsibility without being crushed by it, is what makes Yoda truly wise. And as the firelight fades around his last conversation with Luke, one unanswered question still hangs in the air. What final test will prove whether the student has truly learned what the master had to lose everything to understand? The thread through the saga. That final test is not a single duel or prophecy fulfilled. It is time itself, the slow unfolding of generations under one quiet gaze. The story of Yoda becomes the story of the saga when seen not as scattered scenes, but as a single, continuous thread drawn through galactic history in the final centuries before the fall of the Republic. Yoda stands in the Jedi Temple, surrounded by younglings. He guides their first clumsy steps with training sabers. He explains the Force in simple words that would shape their entire lives around them. The marble halls rise in silent grandeur. Statues of long-dead guardians watch as this small figure carries forward a tradition that has endured for thousands of years. When the Clone Wars erupt, that same figure steps from meditation chambers into war rooms. The calm teacher becomes a general ships burn across the stars. Yet Yoda moves through the conflict with measured purpose on Geonosis. His green blade ignites against the dark power of Count Dooku on Kashyyyk. He rides among towering Rosha trees, defending allies who barely understand the ancient Jedi, standing at their side. What followed was a transformation of the Order itself from peaceful guardians into commanders of an army they never meant to lead. Over time, his presence links eras that never meet High Republic Jedi, who once sat with him in sunlit archives. Anakin Skywalker seeking permission and praise. Luke Skywalker kneeling in Dagobah's mud. Rey standing before his spectral form and the burning tree of old Jedi texts. None of these figures share a room together, yet each carries an echo of the same teacher. Through them, the line of teaching becomes a single river, flowing from distant centuries to the age of the First Order. In exile on Dagobah, the thread does not break. It narrows. Yoda's world shrinks to mist, insects, and the quiet song of the light side around him. But through Luke, the wider empire and its dark masters are still present. Every lesson on that swamp world is also a commentary on the war far away. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. Mercy toward failure, mercy toward fear, mercy toward the Skywalker line itself. Even after death, the thread continues as a pale blue silhouette among the trees. Yoda returns in the sequels, not as a warrior, but as memory made visible. He laughs softly at ancient books. He reminds a broken master that the true Jedi are not pages or temples, but people. This is the pattern. Interrupt in a saga of fleets and super weapons. The most enduring power belongs to a small, unassuming being who waits, listens, and chooses his moments, seen through his enduring eyes. The entire saga ceases to be a chain of disconnected adventures and becomes one long dusk, a slow dimming and brightening of the Force itself. And as that long evening settles, the sharp edges of battles, councils, and prophecies begin to blur into something softer, a continuous sense of time and memory, ready now to drift into quieter corners of Yoda's life, where the noise of empires fades and only the gentle pulse of the Force remains. Drifting back through the centuries in that softened light, the story of Yoda can be traced again, not as sharp scenes but as a single, slow current moving through. The Force. It begins with a small child on a misty, unnamed world, a figure with wide eyes and ears, catching every distant sound before the Jedi ever arrived. There was only fog, low trees, and the quiet rhythm of rain. The power that stirred around him was faint, untrained, a whisper waiting to be heard over. Before long, a shuttle descended through those clouds. Jedi travelers on a routine journey paused, sensing something unusual. What they found there would change everything. Not a prophesied savior, not a warrior, only a frightened child and a timid friend clutching a travel pack. The decision to bring them to Coruscant seemed simple at the time, yet it would shape the next 9 centuries of galactic history. In the temple's endless halls, that child became a nervous initiate, tiny feet padding across polished stone, craning his neck to see towering statues of ancient Jedi Masters. Training sabers hummed in practice chambers. Meditation bells chimed in distant courtyards. Over time, the fear gave way to focus lessons in the light side, in patience and restraint, turned restless curiosity into quiet discipline. What followed was a long apprenticeship that slowly blurred into knighthood during the High Republic's golden age. Yoda moved through sunlit starships and bright academies, a wandering knight, and then a patient teacher of youngling starbeams gleamed off white durasteel. Libraries overflowed with records of worlds at peace. The Jedi Order believed the dark side distant, contained, a threat buried in old holocrons for thousands of years that confidence held. And Yoda's days were filled with guiding small hands through basic forms, correcting stances, and asking gentle questions that opened young minds to the Force centuries later. Those same halls echoed with sterner debates in council chambers as the Republic dimmed around him. The Clone Wars erupted, gunships roared out of hangars, their engines a constant thunder over Coruscant battle reports from Geonosis. Kashyyyk and countless unnamed worlds stacked before the council. Each decision weighed the lives of soldiers and Jedi against a war no one truly understood, even as he led armies. Doubt coiled quietly beneath Yoda's calm exterior, a sense that the dark was rising just beyond sight. Then the temple fell, the familiar corridors filled with smoke and silence. Where younglings once laughed, only scorched walls and empty training rooms remained. The Empire rose from that ruin, and Yoda stepped away from the center of history into the margins on Dagobah. The rain returned endless, patient, soft. The swamp's thick life masked his presence from Sith senses. Firelight flickered against gnarled roots as one last student listened in the dark. Luke Skywalker heard the same teachings given to nameless younglings centuries before about fear, attachment, and the narrow path between the dark side and the light side. When Yoda's body finally faded, his passing was as gentle as an exhale. His form dissolved, but the glow of his Force spirit lingered, a continuous presence at the edge of sight. Later, on Endor's moon, among the trees and embers of a smaller fire, that blue light shone again, not as a return to conflict, but as a quiet reassurance that his watch continued over time. His appearances became less about events and more about presence, a voice in the stillness, a reminder that learning never ends. Even for a master who had seen empires rise and fall, the individual scenes of his life begin to blur. Now misty childhood, marble halls, roaring gunships, dripping swamps, all recede into a single impression. A long life lived in service to something larger than any throne or war effort. That feeling rests on the mind, the way a distant star slowly sets, not vanishing, only sinking below the horizon of memory, while its light still travels on through the dark. A gentle good night from the Grand Master in that lingering afterglow. another pattern becomes clear. The galaxy itself moves in cycles. Empires rise in marble and durasteel, then crumble into ruins. Bright banners of the Republic fade into the muted tones of occupation and rebellion. The light side surges, the dark side answers, and in the midst of those vast swings of power, one small figure simply watches not as a conqueror, not as a prophet, but as a patient witness to the turning of ages over time. This becomes the story of Yoda, more than any single duel or council decree, from the first nervous steps of a young initiate beneath the towering statues of ancient Jedi to the quiet shuffle of an old hermit through Dagobah's mud. His life traces the same arc as the galactic history around him. There is dawn, there is noon, there is twilight, yet through each phase, his gaze remains steady, curious, always learning even when the lesson arrives wrapped in loss. Because his story is not about never falling short. It is about what followed when failure came, when the Clone Wars shattered illusions of control, when the Sith rose not from distant space, but from the very heart of the Republic. The Grand Master did not answer with rage or denial. Instead, there was humility in exile, a willingness to listen again to the living force and to accept that even 9 centuries of wisdom had not been enough to prevent one terrible war over the long years on Dagobah. That humility turned into a different kind of strength. He trained no grand armies, he commanded no fleets, yet the choice to keep teaching to guide a single farm boy from the outer rim would shape everything that came after the fall of the Empire. The redemption of Anakin Skywalker, the faint but real possibility that future generations of Jedi might walk a gentler path, all of it grew from an old master refusing to let failure be the final word. Now, in the quiet of this moment, it is easy to imagine the Grand Master seated nearby small form, wrapped in a simple robe, eyes half closed, not delivering a rousing speech, not recounting every battle or council vote, only sharing a calm presence, the soft creak of an ancient gimmerstick resting on stone, the slow rhythm of breathing that has matched the pulse of the Force for hundreds of years. And in that stillness, a familiar murmur surfaces rest. You must. The pacing of thought slows to match that voice. Each memory of clone troopers and star destroyers, each image of the Jedi Temple or Coruscant's crowded ski lanes drifts apart and fades as though sinking into Dagobah's mist. What followed was not endless struggle, but surrender to something wider than any single order or creed. The same current that carried Yoda from unknown swamps to marble halls and back to the wetlands again now carries countless lives through their own cycles of rise and fall. In this view, sleep is not an escape. It is a gentle alignment with that deeper flow, a quiet joining of the same luminous ocean of energy that Yoda spent his life listening to, the force that bound Sith and Jedi Republic and Empire victory and defeat into one. A vast tapestry as awareness loosens and thoughts grow thin. The story of the Grand Master does not end. It simply recedes into the background hum of that greater presence, waiting patiently for the next dawn, the next lesson, the next turning of the light and the dark. If you wake again, and one more journey awaits in the quiet that follows a story, the mind does something ancient. It drifts between memory and dream, wandering through scenes that have just been heard and worlds that have not yet been seen, somewhere in that space between waking and sleep. The story of the Grand Master continues to echo, even as thoughts grow softer and more distant after so many battles and so many years of service. Yoda's presence in the Force becomes less a voice and more a gentle pressure, a steadying hand on the galactic current. Some listeners by now rest beneath that current, already asleep, carried away on the tide of his history. Others remain awake, yet still, calm eyes closed, breathing slow, letting images of temples and swamps and starlit warships pass quietly in the dark. Over time, stories become another kind of meditation, each tale a slow turning of attention from the noise of the day towards something older and deeper. For thousands of years, Jedi and Sith chased power through conflict and war. Yet in the end, what followed was always the same. The rise and fall of orders, the shifting of empires, the endless balance between the dark side and the light side. And in the middle of it all, small lives, trying to understand what the Force was asking of them on some other night. When rest is needed again, another path through that history waits. There might be the story of a Sith Lord who believed domination would shape the future and paid the price for that certainty, or the story of a smuggler skimming the edge of every law, drawn into events far larger than any single cargo run. Perhaps another Jedi whose doubts and failures mirror Yoda's, yet whose choices lead down a different branch of the same vast river. Each of those lives can be followed in the same calm, measured way, the same unhurried walk through battles, councils and quiet exiles. What they found there would change everything for them. Yet told here, it becomes only a gentle descent into sleep, another long view of the galaxy, turning slowly in silence. If this journey through Yoda's years brought any comfort or rest, a thought may be set aside for later, when waking returns in some distant morning or quiet afternoon. A listener might remember this calm and choose to subscribe or leave a small message, naming the next life, the next corner of galactic history to explore. No urgency. Touches that choice. It waits patiently, the way the Force itself waits for attention far above Dagobah's mists and Coruscant's towers. The galaxy keeps its slow rotation stars wheeling in enormous silence. The scars of war and empire hidden beneath the glow. Somewhere within that endless night, Yoda remains a faint presence in the Force. A soft green ember that does not demand, only reassures. The story of the Grand Master settles now into the background hum once more. And in that hush, one last question lingers. What other secret threads are still woven through the dark, waiting to be followed when the next night comes?